They mocked the cleaning man, until he fired the CEO right in the boardroom. They didn't even stop laughing when Zeke Johnson dropped the battered leather folder onto the boardroom table. It landed with a sharp slap, slicing through the room's sterile hum, and for a second, even the executives in their tailored suits blinked. To them, he was still the janitor, the man who wiped their fingerprints from the glass doors and emptied their half-eaten lunches from trash cans. They didn't know the man standing in front of them had spent 19 years recording everything they thought they had buried. 19 years and 7 months, to be exact. Zeke knew, because he had written every day into a notebook his late wife, Deborah, had given him, the same woman who died after the company's insurance adjustments quietly denied her final treatment. He didn't start writing out of anger. He started because he needed to hold on to something when the world stopped looking at him. They laughed at the mop he used to carry, but they never noticed the steadiness of the hands that gripped it, hands that once rebuilt communications lines under enemy fire, hands that once signed contracts for a small business that folded after one bad year and one missed payment, hands that had buried a wife with dignity, even when dignity came cheaper than a gravestone. Zeke hadn't always been invisible. They had made him that way. And today, he wasn't cleaning up after them. He was here to show them everything they had thrown away and everything they had forgotten to fear. Because when the foundation you ignore finally cracks, it doesn't whisper. It roars. Zeke Johnson had been invisible for so long that he started to believe it was a kind of power. People talked freely around him, as if the mop handle made him deaf, as if the uniform stripped him of memory. But Zeke remembered everything. He remembered the names they forgot, the looks they gave when no one important was watching, the way their smiles vanished once the cameras were off and the shareholders were satisfied. He had learned early in life that silence was a form of armor. It came from being a black man in Mississippi in the 60s, where speaking out could get you fired, or worse. His father taught him to speak through action, to endure with dignity. So when the executives at Marshall and Finch treated him like background noise, Zeke didn't react. He listened. He listened when they joked about downsizing departments full of single mothers. He listened when they called the old receptionist dead weight right after her husband died. He listened when a junior analyst, brighter than anyone in the room, was dismissed mid-sentence because her degree wasn't from an Ivy League school. Every insult landed like dust on his boots. He carried them home, swept them into memory, and wrote them down at his kitchen table beside his wife's old photo. He didn't know, not yet, what he'd do with all of it. But he knew this much. Truth doesn't go away just because no one wants to see it. And that's what made Zeke dangerous. Not because he was angry, but because he was paying attention. They never saw him. Not really. But he saw them. Every lie, every cover-up, every face turned away when the cleaning crew entered the room. Zeke didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He just needed the right moment. And that moment was coming. There's a kind of power that walks into a room and demands attention. Then there's the kind that slips through the side door before dawn, unnoticed, and ends up knowing more about a company than the people who run it. Zeke Johnson had that kind of power, the kind you don't brag about, the type built slowly, layer by layer, through years of quiet work and sharper observation. He'd never been the type to push his way into a room. He'd fought in places where men died for less than a raised voice. So Zeke learned early that real power wasn't loud. It was patient, steady, purposeful. Every morning, as the city still slept, Zeke arrived before the executives. He repaired the lights that no one thanked him for. He unclogged the toilets, but no one even noticed. He swept conference rooms where deals were made that hurt people like him, and he listened. He learned which manager cut bonuses while increasing their own. Which director had 2 versions of every report, one for the board and one for the books. He heard them talk about efficiency when they meant layoffs, restructuring when they meant replacing people with friends. But Zeke didn't collect their sins out of bitterness. He collected them like puzzle pieces, because he knew one day someone would ask, how did it all fall apart? And when that day came, Zeke wanted to be ready, not with vengeance, but with facts, not with rage, but with resolve. While they polished their titles and praised each other in company newsletters, Zeke was building something else. A clear, undeniable account of what happened inside the glass tower. And he wasn't going to use it to take power for himself. He was going to return it to the people who deserved it. Zeke Johnson didn't need a clipboard or a corner office to keep records. He carried them in his mind, in his hands, in the ache of his back after long nights walking floors that no one else bothered to clean. But more than tasks or gossip, Zeke remembered people. The kind of people the company used and discarded with the same casualness they applied to office furniture. He remembered the name of the woman from HR who left crying one night after speaking up about harassment. 2 weeks later, she was let go. No explanation, just silence and a cardboard box. Zeke helped carry it to her car. She had thanked him softly. No one else did. He remembered the intern with a stutter, bright, eager, kind. The executive team never learned his name. Zeke did. The boy left after 3 months, convinced he wasn't cut out for business. But Zeke knew he was more honest than half the men in that boardroom. He remembered the janitorial night shift supervisor, Maria, who got reprimanded for causing discomfort after reporting mold in the break room walls. Zeke saw her standing outside one night, her hands cupped around her breath, shaking with frustration. No one inside even noticed she was gone the following week. To others, these were footnotes, forgotten quickly, filed under inconvenience. To Zeke, there were reasons. He didn't speak of them. He honored them. Every time he wrote in his notebook, it wasn't to attack. It was to preserve. The memory of those who tried to make the place better. The proof that this company didn't break overnight. It broke slowly, each time someone looked away when they should have stood up. And when Zeke finally rose to speak, he would carry their names with him, not for revenge, but for justice. Because someone had to remember what everyone else had chosen to forget. Zeke Johnson never raised his voice, but that didn't mean he didn't feel the weight of every unspoken word. The silence, at first, was a shield, a way to survive. But as the years passed, it became something heavier, like walking with a whole bucket of water, careful not to spill, even as the weight pressed deeper into his bones. He began spending more time in the maintenance closet, not to rest, but to think. He sat on an old milk crate with his notebook, scribbling everything he'd heard, seen, sensed. Names, dates, patterns. He wasn't planning revenge. He was building a map, not to destroy the company, but to lead it back to the truth. He knew people might not believe him. He knew how easily powerful men dismissed those who were quiet. But he also knew that truth, when backed by time, memory, and integrity, is impossible to ignore forever. That's when he made a decision. He would no longer remember. He would act. He reached out to someone he trusted, a former accountant who'd been fired for redundancy after questioning the CFO's reports. Then, a young lawyer who'd once asked HR too many questions. Slowly, Zeke started to assemble more than a folder. He was building something undeniable, irrefutable. Quietly, methodically, with the same steady hands that had cleaned their messes for 2 decades. Have you ever held your tongue because you knew the truth wouldn't be welcomed? Have you ever stayed quiet to protect your job, your family, your peace, but deep down knew that silence was costing something greater? If you've ever been in that place, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Your voice matters here. Leave a comment, share your story, or let me know if this one moved you. It keeps this space human. Zeke's silence was never weakness. It was a strategy. And now, the room would learn what truth sounds like, after years of being ignored. Tuesday mornings at Marshall and Finch always smelled like overconfidence. Espresso machines humming, leather shoes echoing on polished floors, voices bouncing off glass walls with a little too much self-congratulation. But this Tuesday, something was different. It wasn't in the air. It was in the silence that followed Zeke Johnson's footsteps as he pushed his cleaning cart into the boardroom at 8:59 a.m. They didn't notice him at first. They rarely did, until he didn't turn around and leave, until he reached into his cart and pulled out something they'd never seen him carry before, a weathered brown folder marked with the company's name in bold. No cleaner's checklist, no work order. Just paper, heavy with memory. The CEO, a man who loved to talk, cleared his throat and said, "We're in a meeting, Zeke." But Zeke didn't move. He didn't blink. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm here." There was an uneasy laugh from someone at the end of the table. Another voice muttered something about security. Zeke said nothing. He simply placed the folder in the center of the table as if it were a verdict. One by one, they looked up. At the man they'd never really seen. Not the janitor, not the background figure, but the historian of their decisions. Zeke opened the folder slowly. Inside, photocopies of emails, records of bonuses after layoffs, spreadsheets that didn't match, resignation letters that had been buried, and names, so many names. Then he said calmly, "This isn't to destroy anyone. It's to remind you what you forgot. Who do you forget?" What would you do if someone you had never acknowledged turned out to know everything about who you are at work? Would you be proud or terrified? Let me know in the comments. Your honesty inspires someone else to do better. The janitor they'd mocked had become the man they could no longer ignore, and the boardroom for once went quiet. The walls of the boardroom were lined with framed photos of founders, partners, and former CEOs. They were always men, always smiling, always the kind of faces that fit the polished language of legacy and leadership. But Zeke Johnson hadn't come to talk about them. He came for the names that were never framed. He looked around the room, executives shifting in their seats, trying to understand whether this was a joke, a protest, or a threat. But it was none of those. It was a reckoning built on memory, on presence, on witnessing. Zeke reached into the folder again, this time pulling out a folded sheet of paper, not typed, but handwritten in blue ink. He paused before reading it aloud. "This is for Gloria Martinez," he said quietly. "Custodial lead, 15 years of service. Let go without severance after missing a shift to care for her dying mother." He took a breath. "For Darnell Thomas, warehouse staff. Died from a heart attack in the break room. The AED was broken. The safety report disappeared." He continued. Name after name, story after story. One woman wiped her eyes. A man shifted uncomfortably and looked down at his shoes. Zeke's voice didn't tremble. He wasn't reading to shame them. He was reading so they wouldn't forget. "These aren't just stories," he said. "They are people you stopped seeing the moment they no longer served your bottom line." Have you ever worked with someone who quietly disappeared, without applause, without thanks? Did you ever wonder what happened to them? Or did you, like so many, move on? If someone comes to mind, share their name below. Say it out loud. They deserve to be remembered. Because legacy isn't built on titles. It's built on people. And Zeke Johnson, the janitor they never saw, had become the keeper of all their names. Zeke Johnson stood in front of the conference table like a man laying bricks, not for a wall, but for a foundation. His voice never wavered, because he wasn't here to attack. He was here to rebuild something they didn't even realize they'd broken. Respect. "I know what you think leadership looks like," he said. "It's the suits, the titles, the reports with color-coded charts. But let me tell you what it looks like to the rest of us." He glanced toward the window, then back at them. "It looks like Sam, the night guard who hasn't missed a shift in 12 years. Like May, who sorts the mailroom every Friday after someone from marketing messes it up. Like Reggie, who fixes the elevators at 2 a.m. so your investors don't get stuck in the morning." Zeke walked to the head of the table, the very seat where the CEO usually sat, and rested his hand on its smooth, polished surface. "You think this company runs because of vision boards and mission statements," he said. "But it runs because people like them show up, day after day, to carry weight you've never touched." He let that hang in the air. They don't ask for awards. They ask for decency, for eye contact, for fair pay, and not to be talked about like broken parts in a machine. If you run a business, or even work in one, when was the last time you looked at the people holding it up? Not just the ones giving the orders, but the ones making the orders possible. Comment below. Who in your workplace keeps things running, even when no one's watching? Please give them a name. Let them be seen. Zeke didn't come to take power. He came to return value to the people who had created it all along. They thought Zeke Johnson stayed quiet because he had nothing to say. They thought silence was submission, that his steady hands and bowed head meant he was used to being beneath them. But Zeke's silence was never surrender. It was study. It was the strategy. Every day he cleaned their offices. He was also cleaning their illusions. Behind his calm eyes lay a mind that measured the weight of hypocrisy, timing the rise and fall of decisions made in haste and protected by power. Zeke didn't shout because he knew the system was trained to dismiss noise. He didn't protest in the hallways because he knew the cameras never pointed there. Instead, he waited, not out of fear, but out of understanding. He learned this the hard way, long before he walked these marble floors. In his hometown of Yazoo City, Mississippi, he witnessed his father lose his job for speaking the truth too early and too loudly. He remembered the ache in his mother's voice when she said, "Sometimes you have to plant the seed and wait for the right season." So Zeke waited. He watched patterns repeat. He watched voices rise and vanish. And he wrote. His notebook became a quiet archive. Dates, quotes, contradictions. But more than that, it became a compass, a way to track not just their corruption, but his clarity. The day he chose to speak wasn't random. It was the moment when his silence no longer protected the truth, but threatened to bury it. And that was something Zeke couldn't allow. He wasn't here to explode. He was here to expose. And exposure, when done right, doesn't need a megaphone. It just needs a man who's been listening long enough to know exactly when the room is ready to hear. For years, Zeke Johnson had walked the corridors as if he were part of the wallpaper. Doors didn't open for him. They closed behind him. Conversations stopped when he entered the room. But now, for the first time, no one moved. No one spoke. and every eye was on him. He stood tall, not with arrogance, but with the grounded stillness of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. The CEO tried to interrupt, but Zeke held up one hand, calm but commanding. The gesture wasn't loud, but it stopped the room cold. "I'm not here to take your place," Zeke said. "I'm here to remind you how far you've drifted from the place you started." He laid the final set of documents on the table. Financial inconsistencies, suppressed complaints, discarded exit interviews, facts, not opinions, truth, not interpretation. There was no yelling, no threats, only clarity. And suddenly, the power in the room shifted. The suits no longer felt like armor. They felt like paper. One board member, older than the rest, leaned forward and asked, almost softly, "Why now?" Zeke looked at him, not with anger, but with something more profound. "Because the silence started costing more than my peace," he said. "It started costing other people their livelihoods, their dignity, their lives." He didn't ask for anyone to be fired. He didn't demand a title or a seat at the table. He only asked for action, for accountability, for change, not tomorrow, but now. And what stunned them most wasn't the evidence. It was that the man they'd never seen coming didn't want their power. He wanted their humanity. And in that moment, Zeke Johnson was no longer the janitor. He was the company's conscience. Zeke Johnson didn't walk out of the boardroom like a man who had won. He walked out like a man who had finished something he never asked to begin. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't smile. He nodded once to the room behind him, then stepped forward into a future he'd helped shift, quietly, irrevocably. This story isn't about overthrowing a CEO. It's about restoring value to what truly matters: people, memory, and the courage to speak when silence has gone on too long. Zeke reminded us that leadership isn't reserved for those with titles or stock options. Sometimes it belongs to the one who listens, the one who endures, and the one who chooses the exact right moment to say, "Enough." If you had been in Zeke's place, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet or spoken out? What do you think about Zeke's choice to expose the truth with grace instead of vengeance? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Your voice matters here. If this story moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of someone you once knew, remember to like, share, or subscribe so you don't miss the following story that dares to speak softly but lands hard. And more than anything, leave a comment below. Every word you share keeps stories like Zeke's alive. Thank you for listening.